We'd like to start answering your questions. Remember, send them to the email address on your screen. To get started, we're going to take a question from our students here at Boundary Bay. How does pollution affect wetlands? We've got our guest panelists back to join us. Come on in, Rob.
All right.
Why don't you get on in here? Thanks, guys. So how does pollution affect wetlands? Big question.
It can have all kinds of effects because the nutrients that come in the pollution can make the plants grow for a little while, but eventually what happens is it takes all the oxygen out of the water. And when that happens, then the animals that live here, the fish particularly, run out of oxygen. So this is not very good to have a lot of pollution around. The marshes help with some of that. They will absorb some of those pollutants, which is a good thing. But if you get too much of it, then it gets starved of oxygen.
Thanks, Rob. Okay, we have another question in from Logan in Boise, Idaho. How large is the wetland where we are today?
This is a big wetland in Boundary Bay. It's probably about 10 miles from one end to the other. And then maybe, you can see how far back here, maybe a couple hundred meters. So the wetland itself, the plants, is a very narrow band. But when the tide goes down, it's going to go down about a mile. So it's big. It's a big, expansive area.
Okay, our next question is from Eldred Vossler at Laura Wilder Elementary in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. What kinds of other animals live in the wetlands at Boundary Bay?
We saw coyote tracks.
Oh, cool.
We saw coyote tracks out in the water, and we saw a number of the crustaceans kind of washed up. They kind of come up in the intertidal, and lots of bugs, of course, and amazing the number of crustaceans. Yeah.
That's good. That's good. Yeah.
So, are there any recorded invasive plants that you guys have found here in Boundary Bay?
Well, I would love to answer that question.
Great.
There is a marsh grass that we think is out here called Spartina, which forms really dense clumps and kind of takes over and dries out the sections of the marsh that it's on. So that's a big problem. And this, just along the periphery, we're looking up on the dike here, and there are clumps of a grass called knotweed, not a grass. It's sort of bamboo-like and gets huge and has roots that go down 7 feet and then 20 feet in all directions. And where it grows, nothing else can grow it. It's almost impossible to get rid of it when it comes into an area. So it's a really big problem here, the knotweed.
Thank you.
Can I just add
please.
about I just talked to the person last night about the Spartina, who's been doing a lot of the volunteer work of trying to get rid of it on the bay. She says they're feeling like they're getting a handle on it, but it's a really hard slug. And if you ever want to volunteer for something that's really hard, that's it. Okay. You're out digging these plants out.
So our next question comes from Amy Duke in Taos, New Mexico. How wet does a wetland need to be considered a wetland?
Oh, what a good question. I think what it means is that the water returns every year. There's water here all the time, so some of them will dry out and they will become dry for some of the year. But when it rains, it fills again. So it has to have water on a regular basis because these plants that grow here are really dependent on that. So you could just look at the wetland, and if it's got a marsh, then it's likely got water for most of the year, and that would be a good measure dictating if it's a wetland or not.
And our next question, from Michelle Tamez in Washington, D.C. How are the animals on the shore adapted to the changing tides, which come in and out throughout the day?
Take that?
Sure, I'll take a bit of it anyway. It's not an easy life. They have to somehow create a situation where they can tolerate both fresh water and salt water, and that's not an easy bit. The crabs do it, classically by being able to hold on to some moisture, staying moist, staying usually under things. We found here at the low tide the amphipods, which are a type of crustacean, were all under. A lot of them were under things where it's moist, so they kind of keep the moisture levels as much as possible. Some of them burrow, right, and handle that. But that's a real challenge to get to do both the salt and fresh at the same time.
Thanks. Our next question comes from the Young Women's Leadership Academy in Fort Worth, Texas. What is the biggest threat to wetlands water quality?
You want to take it, Rob?
Well, on the wetland, On the wetland right here, a big threat to water quality is the dike behind and the agricultural fields on the other side. And we have an outfall here, and we have fertilizers, sometimes pesticides, that will leach out. And the farm fields nearby are probably one of the biggest threats right here.
Okay, our next question actually builds on a previous one. A little more description on just what are invasive species. And that's a question from Mrs. Payton's class in New York.
Well, there are all kinds of species that are invasive, and we talked about the plants, but we can have all kinds of even little shrimpy things or various animals that come in perhaps on a boat from another part of the world that would settle here and have no predators and do really well and outstrip all the local animals and take over an area. So it can be a big problem. You think of any part of the plant or animal kingdom, anything, and there are invasives in all categories that we need to be thinking about.
Thank you. So we've got a question from Discovery Middle School students in Mansfield, Ohio. Is this wetland a healthy wetland? Why or why not?
I can take that. Yeah, we think this is a pretty healthy wetland. We've done quite a bit to protect it. We've set aside the legislation to protect that. And that was probably the major threat was, we just thought it as a wasteland, but now it is protected. And it's got lots of designations. There's lots of people watching it. It doesn't mean that there's not issues and problems and things. There are, all wetlands face these kinds of things. But this one is pretty secure. I think we're in pretty good shape here.
Great. We've got a question from Ms. Borisevic's class in Taneytown, Maryland. How do the plants grow if it's saltwater?
I can take that one. That's a great question. These are plants that are adapted to this to get rid of the salt, and they're able to take in the water as a result of that. So they're specially designed to deal with salt. They can't grow anywhere else. They actually need to have these kinds of conditions, and it makes it these special things. They're called halophytes because they are plants that can deal with salt.
Okay, Hunter from Cole Center, Pennsylvania wants to know, what is the most dangerous predator here?
You're giving that to me. The most dangerous predator. Well, we did hear earlier about the peregrine falcon, which is the fastest animal on the planet. It's a type of falcon that flies at, as we heard, 200 kilometers an hour. And so that one is pretty devastating because it can come in and catch a bird at that sort of speed and the bird isn't able to get away. Also, we have a lot of bald eagles. Bald eagles spend their winter here, and we have hundreds of them that spend their winter here catching the ducks and generally terrorizing everybody and chasing them around. And they're a pretty voracious predator as well. But they're birds that are more likely to go after things that are already hurt or that are more sick. Whereas the peregrine goes after things that are doing pretty well and that can fly pretty fast. So those are pretty cool predators, and that's pretty neat. So.
Thanks, Holly. So we've got another question from Mrs. Payton's class in New York. What makes the wetlands such ideal places for nurseries?
I can take that one again.
Take that one.
Yeah. One of the things is that these animals, when they're very small, of course, they're very vulnerable to predators, and it's really important that they have a place that's safe and then get away from some of those predators. So by hiding in the grass, that's one place they can hide. There's a plant down on the low tide that you can't see from here called eelgrass, and it's very, very extensive. If you walk through that eelgrass and look, you can't see the fish, but they're in there, and as you saw from the beach scene, there's lots and lots of them around. And they're feeding in there on all the little invertebrates and things that are clinging to the eelgrass plants. So there's lots and lots of food, and it's a safe place to be. And those fish can then grow and get to a fairly good size, and then they can reproduce, and that's what makes it a nursery.
Thanks, Rob. We have a question from Delaney Carlson in Missoula, Montana. Are there any plants in the wetlands that are carnivores? Maya, thanks.
Especially in bogs, you can find these plants that are called sundews, and they're carnivorous. And they look like mini Venus flytraps. They grow to be about the length of your pinky if they're very large. And instead of snapping shut really quickly, they are sticky, hence the name sundews. And they close very slowly with the bugs stuck to them. And they eat damselflies very commonly. And they will actually only get a very little bit of nutrient from digesting a bug, and it takes them days to digest it.
Thanks, Maya. Okay, our next question comes from Wendy Burlett in Shelton, Washington. If there is so much food in Alaska wetlands, why do the birds have to migrate?
That's a great question. There is a lot of food up in Alaska, but of course in the winter it freezes over, and eventually those birds will have to move out because it's going to be covered in ice and all the food won't be available to them. Many of them will come down here because we don't get very much ice, but there's others that carry on even further south. But it's largely because of that. It's largely because it freezes over and there's nothing for them in the winter.
Okay, we have a question from Colegio Brader in Panama. What challenges are you facing trying to protect wetlands?
This is a challenge all over trying to do this. The most important thing is just trying to get people aware, like we're trying to do here, of how important these are. Once people know this, then they will also go out and try to protect them. And there's lots of programs and things to try to encourage people, this is one of them, to understand how important these wetlands are. And people now across the hemisphere, in Panama, South America, North America, realize this, and kids realize this too. So this is the number one thing, is being aware of this. The next thing is then talking to the people in government and people who own the land about how important it is and trying to get it set aside and make it a special place for all the wildlife that's there.
Great. And finally, what time of the year would you come to Boundary Bay and see the largest number and find the largest number of birds?
That would be during the spring migration, when we have the shorebirds that are coming up here. You can have upwards of 500,000 birds just here in this area here. And if you can imagine how many birds would have to fit into that you could fit into here, it's chock-a-block. It's completely jammed with birds. Another really good time to come here is during the winter, during this time of year. And that's a different kind of bird that we have here. We have a lot of ducks that spend the winter here. We have about 200,000 birds. The ducks, the 3 different species of ducks that spend their winter here. And so they're all spending the time in the marsh and in the eelgrass and far out in the marine areas. And during the nighttime, they're spending all their time up in the farmlands, eating the potatoes that were left behind and the different grasses that we have planted here for cattle, but also for the waterfowl in particular to encourage them to stay here. So there's 2 times that are really good. Winter is really good, but so is the spring migration. And that's because there's different types of birds here, but there's always something really cool to look at.
So we have time for one more quick question. And this comes from Atlanta, Georgia. How do extreme temperature fluctuations affect the wetland ecosystem? Briefly.
Well, you can imagine if it got very, very hot and dry in a wetland, the water will dry up and those plants will disappear. They just can't survive. They have to have the water. If it gets very, very wet, well, that's a little bit better, but they can drown them as well. So if you get those big fluctuations, you've got real problems.
Thanks, Rob. Thank you all for your great questions.